There we go. Thanks so much, Ollie, for organising this and for inviting me to speak. It's always a pleasure to speak to kind of a really diverse audience outside of the kind of scientific community to see how these ideas and some of the stuff I've been working on land. So yeah, my field of research is in trying to understand the kind of, I guess, the sensory experiences of artists. So I started off in the arts myself. I went to art school, and I became, I guess, very similar to Ollie, I became really interested in the kind of phenomenology of being an artist, and especially in terms of drawing. So these are some of my drawings from art school. I became really interested in the kind of psychological processes underlying our ability to draw. And so when thinking about this, I sort of, you start to think about, so as a psychologist, what I tend to do when I think about a kind of a problem in the arts that I want to focus on, you start to have to break it down into its kind of subcomponents. So when I was thinking about drawing, you're thinking, well, especially if I'm drawing something in the world, but if I'm also drawing something in my mind's eye, then obviously it's engaging my visual system. So we're talking about perception, and I'm sure Diana's going to be talking a lot more about auditory perception in relation to music, but thinking how do perceptual systems respond to kind of higher level thinking, and then how does this all get kind of transformed into an action plan? How do I then move my body to produce some kind of amalgam of what's going on inside my brain? So I started as an undergraduate student and then later through a PhD and postdoc to start to question, okay, what is this process? How do we learn how to draw? What kinds of other psychological capacities come along with our ability to draw by thinking about all of these different kind of components of drawing? So I set myself quite a big task, and I was really surprised when I started researching in this field that there wasn't a huge amount of research looking at sort of differing levels of drawing expertise and how this related to some of these psychological processes. And one of the things that I've started to become really interested in is the notion of visual attention. So the idea that whenever we look at an image or our visual environment, that we might focus on particular things in the environment. And what I got particularly interested in is the idea of looking at the kind of global aspects of an environment. So that's like getting the gist. So when you enter into this room, your overall impression of what the room looks like how high the ceiling is, how many people are in it. And then once you've got that kind of gist level representation, you start to zoom in on the little details and you start to inspect little bits of the image. And so a good analogy for thinking about this is thinking about the relationship between the forest and the trees. And our visual system tends to prioritize perception of the forest first, and then we zoom in on the trees. And there was a little bit of research to suggest that this ability to kind of zoom in into the local and zoom out to the global was related to our ability to draw. So that's really, where I started off. And most of my research involves asking artists to come into the lab, do some drawings for me, and I tend to compare those to people with sort of minimal drawing experience. And what I found in some early research was that this ability to really zoom in to the details of an image seems to relate to your ability to draw. And sort of through this line of work, I became interested in this idea of flexibility of visual attention. So yes, focusing on the details is kind of important sometimes, particularly for some artistic practice. But there are lots of anecdotal accounts of artists sort of playing visual games with their environment and switching between different representations, and sometimes that's made really explicit in artworks like this sculpture by Picasso or this painting by Salvador Dali that deliberately has these kind of different representations based on what components of the artworks you focus on. And when Picasso talks about this the generation of this bull's head sculpture, he talks about how he just goes into his garage one day and he sees the bicycle seat and the handlebars, and suddenly they come together to form this bull's head representation. So I think it seems to be something that a lot of visual artists do almost intuitively to sort of interrogate their visual environment and use that to generate new artworks. So when it comes to like how do we sort of measure this ability in the lab, this kind of tendency to flexibly allocate our attention, it's hard to use real-world sort of environmental stimuli, so we tend to use quite boring tasks in the lab, but they get at the kind of component that we're really interested in. So this is called a bistable image. So if you just sort of look towards the center of this field of rotating dots, what you should see is a kind of 3D cylinder. And it should be moving in one direction or the other, so left to right or right to left. And if you look at it long enough, you should see the direction of the cylinder switch. So if it was moving left to right, you see it moving right to left. Now, nothing is changing in this image, so it's just this video on repeat. What is happening is the field of dots that are moving, what is coming out in the foreground and the background systematically switches. So this is one way in the lab that we measure this tendency to kind of switch between different elements of a visual stimulus. So we get our artists to come into the lab, we get them to watch this for a few minutes and report how often they see this switching happening. And what I found with a group of artists is that they can elicit these switches more quickly and more frequently. They seem to have more control over these attentional processes than our non-artists. So some evidence to suggest that yes, that you're, as an artist, as a visual artist, and particularly artists that draw a lot, you're honing this ability to kind of look flexibly at your environment and attend to the things that are important. One question that comes up a lot in my research, or I get asked a lot when I do sort of interviews and stuff, is this innate? Like, are we born with this kind of attentional ability? And does that mean we gravitate towards visual art because even as a young child, maybe we notice that we do this thing with our visual environment? And so I did a little bit of work. I moved to New York for a year and worked with the Pratt Institute of Design in Brooklyn to look at how their students' attentional abilities changed as a result of their artistic training. So all of their students do this kind of really rigorous design drawing course in their first year of undergrad. And we looked at how these attentional capacities change over time and in relation to their emerging drawing skill. And we find that it does develop over time. So I think my answer to this question of sort of the nature-nurture debate that kind of hounds anyone working in psychology is that it's sort of a combination of the two. Like, I buy into the idea that from a young age, we all have different capacities, different interests, different personalities that mean that we gravitate towards certain activities over others. But all of this is super malleable. Our brains are super flexible. They change over time. And so even these kind of what would be considered quite basic sort of perceptual abilities can be changed as a function of artistic training. Some of the other work I've done is starting to dig more into the process of drawing and making art. So far, a lot of the work I've presented, we look at kind of artists or non-artists, or we look at like drawings, sort of skilled drawings versus unskilled drawings, and how that relates to some of these abilities. But I've become interested in how does the artistic process unfold, and how does that relate to the outcome? So we've done some work looking at tapping into this kind of local global idea again. Do to artists that start with more of a gist level representation and move to the local, produce better quality art than people that just fixate on the local. And we've also used eye tracking to look at this kind of drawing process online. So this is a study where we had artists and non-artists in the lab wearing eye tracking glasses. So what we can do is look at where their eyes are directed when they're looking at any kind of visual image. And so we had them do a drawing task, and then we can look at the distribution of the eye movements. So that's what you can see on screen, basically where the eyes are moving on this image as they're drawing it. And what we find generally is for our more skilled drawing group, they tend to sample much more widely from the image, and really looking at the relationship between parts of the image to each other versus the non-skilled artists on the right who focus very much on the kind of most kind of salient bits of the image. So for example, in a face, they get very fixated on the eyes and the nose and the mouth. So I think using these kind of psychological methods, we can really start to understand how these processes of perception unfold when people are creating artworks. One thing that I've started to work on just in the past few years is really thinking about how artistic behavior has an impact on our experience of finished artworks. So obviously when we go to an art gallery or a museum, we often just see the finished product of an artwork. But I think as human beings, we're very good at inferring what the creative process underlying an artwork was. And so effectively, what we might be doing is internally simulating what Picasso is doing, even if we can only see the finished product of the artwork. So I've been doing some research lately that really looks at how people tap into the process of making an artwork when they're making judgments about how engaged with an artwork they are. And I would say at least for some artworks, this being able to make evident the creative process and the intentions of the artist is a really important way of connecting with the viewer. This feeds into another line of research, a project I'm working on with colleagues in computing at Goldsmiths that looks at how does this interact with robotics and AI. So we're working on a project where we have artists and residents come and work with some robotic systems that we have at Goldsmiths. And as a psychologist, I'm really interested in what the role of the human body is in this kind of attempt to understand and uncover intentionality in artwork. So if we show someone a video of a robot producing an artwork versus a human-generated artwork, what are the differences and what kinds of processes of intentionality are playing a role in how we understand work that's created using kind of AI and robotics and humans. And I think obviously this is a really compelling issue, not just for artists, also for psychologists in the world of science. This issue of the use of AI and what it does for our understanding of kind of creativity and the artistic process. But I think the role of the body is really, I guess, underrepresented in a lot of discussions around the value of AI art that is purely digital. Okay, so that is a whistle-stop tour of understanding perceptual differences in artists and some of the impacts it might have on how we understand finished artworks. So yeah, thank you very much for listening. And yeah, Ollie mentioned it already, but I'm the program director of an MSc in Psychology of the Arts, Neuroaesthetics, and Creativity at Goldsmiths. So if anyone's interested in digging more into the science of the arts, then do visit our website and have a look, or get in touch with me directly. I'd love to have a chat. yeah, and happy to take questions. Thank you very much.